A girl rescued an injured deer, and what it did 2 years later is unbelievable. On a crisp autumn evening, 12-year-old Emily walked home through the woods after visiting her grandmother. The sky, painted in shades of gold and crimson, cast long shadows through the trees. The air smelled of damp earth and fallen leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl echoed through the forest. As she carefully stepped over a cluster of exposed roots, a faint, pained cry made her stop. She held her breath. There it was again, a soft, broken whimper carried by the breeze. Something was out there, something suffering. Curiosity and concern propelled her forward. She followed the sound, her heart thumping in her chest. The dense foliage rustled as she pushed through the underbrush. Then she saw it. Lying in the thick carpet of leaves was a young deer, its tawny fur stained with blood. Its right hind leg was twisted unnaturally, and its dark eyes were filled with fear and pain. It had likely been hit by a car and had somehow limped into the woods, seeking refuge. Emily's heart ached. The deer was too weak to flee, yet its body tensed as she took a slow step forward. "It's okay," she whispered, lowering herself to the ground. "I'm not going to hurt you." The deer flinched but remained still. Emily hesitated, then shrugged off her jacket and gently laid it over its trembling body. The night was getting colder and she couldn't bear the thought of leaving it alone to freeze. But what could she do? It was too big for her to carry, yet she couldn't leave it here to die. Swallowing her fear, she knelt beside the injured creature and carefully slipped her arms under its fragile frame. It was heavier than she expected, but something deep inside her refused to give up. Straining every muscle, she began dragging it inch by inch toward home. By the time she reached the small barn behind her house, her arms burned, her fingers were numb, and her breath came in ragged gasps. Yet despite the exhaustion, she felt a fierce determination. This deer needed her. She wouldn't let it down. When her parents saw her struggling with the injured creature, they rushed outside, their expressions filled with shock. "Emily, what are you doing?" her father exclaimed, his eyes widening. "It's hurt," she cried, her voice trembling. "I couldn't just leave it." Her mother glanced at the deer, its breath shallow, its eyes glassy with pain. She sighed, shaking her head. "We need to call the vet." For the next several weeks, Emily dedicated herself to nursing the deer back to health. She named it Willow, feeling the name suited its gentle nature. Every morning before school, she cleaned its wound, changed the bandages, and whispered soothing words as she stroked its soft fur. Every evening she sat beside it, feeding it apples, carrots, and leaves from the yard. Slowly, Willow began to trust her. Its once fearful eyes softened. It allowed her touch without flinching. And then, one miraculous morning, it stood on its own. Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she watched Willow take its first tentative steps. She had done it. She had saved a life. But deep down, she knew what came next. The day arrived when Willow was strong enough to return to the wild. Emily led it to the edge of the woods, her heart heavy, but her resolve firm. Kneeling, she cupped its face in her hands. "You'll be okay now," she murmured. Willow hesitated, staring at her as if memorizing her face. Then, with one last look, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Emily stood there long after it was gone, the wind rustling through the branches. She told herself she had done the right thing, but it didn't make the ache in her chest any less painful. 2 years later, a fierce winter storm swept through the town. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the windows. Snow piled high against the doors, and the roads had become treacherous sheets of ice. Emily, now 14, was home alone while her parents were stranded on the other side of town due to the road closures. She sat curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, listening to the storm rage outside. The fire crackled in the hearth, offering warmth against the biting cold. She had just started to doze off when a sudden thud against the back door jolted her awake. Her pulse spiked. Another thud, then another. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate. Something or someone was outside. Heart pounding, she grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the window. The moment she shone the light outside, her breath caught in her throat. A full-grown deer stood there, its body covered in snow, its breath visible in the frigid air. But it wasn't just any deer. It was Willow. Emily's eyes widened in shock. How? How had Willow found its way back after all this time? Then she noticed something else. Willow wasn't alone. Behind her stood a fawn, a tiny, frail baby deer, shivering violently in the cold. Tears sprang to Emily's eyes as understanding washed over her. Willow remembered. She remembered the girl who had once saved her life, and now she was asking for help again. Without hesitation, Emily unlatched the door and pushed it open. The icy wind blasted against her skin, but she didn't care. "Come inside," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Willow stepped forward cautiously, the fawn wobbling in behind her. Emily quickly grabbed blankets, laying them by the fireplace. As Willow settled down, Emily knelt beside her, stroking her fur. "You knew I'd help, didn't you?" she whispered. Willow pressed her nose against Emily's hand, a silent thank you. As the storm raged outside, Emily lay beside them, warmth filling her heart. She had once saved Willow's life, and now that life had returned to her with a miracle of its own. Some bonds, she realized, were never meant to be broken.